Hi, I'm Lisa from Australian travel and migration blog dreamingofdownunder.com, and today I'll be sharing 18 tips on flying during COVID-19. I flew from London to Sydney back in July 2020, which was a 30-hour journey via Hong Kong. It might be easier to book long-haul flights now that more countries have opened up their borders. I've also written a big blog post on the experience as well as on hotel quarantine in Australia, so I'll link to those below. Number one is to check you're allowed into the country you're flying into. So some countries like Australia only allowing their own citizens and residents at the moment, so make sure you find the government website for that country and check their restrictions. Tip number two is to check the quarantine regulations in the country you're travelling to. So Australia, for example, has mandatory hotel quarantine for all international arrivals that costs up to $3,000. Tip number three is to check the restrictions in your own country if you're going on a return trip, because you might have to self-isolate at home when you get back and you might not be able to go back to work. Tip number four is to check the transit restrictions in any countries where you'll be changing planes. I found it really hard to find a way to get to Australia because a lot of countries wouldn't let you even change planes in their airport. I actually saw someone get turned away from check-in at Heathrow because she had a connecting flight with a different airline and she couldn't have her baggage checked all the way through, which was one of the conditions to transit in Hong Kong. Tip number five is to expect date cancellations and changes. I had to keep moving the date in my flight because sections of it kept being cancelled. Flights can change depending on the entry restrictions in the country you're going into or if not enough seats have been sold. And Australia also capped the number of international arrivals that were allowed in the country the day after I arrived, so if I'd left it any later, I probably wouldn't have got back in. Tip number six is to plan how you get to the airport. If you need to use public transport, then check that it's running. The National Express airport services were really limited when I needed to get to Heathrow, so I would have had to either get the train and change in London or get a lift from somebody. Tip number seven, if somebody's giving you a lift to the airport, check whether they're allowed in or not, because at Heathrow, no guests were allowed in with the passengers. Tip number eight is to check which service stations are open on the motorways in case they're limited. If somebody's giving you a lift, you might need to plan where you can stop if it's a long journey. Tip number nine is to check what time you're allowed to check in for your flight, because Heathrow actually asked you not to get there more than 3 hours before so the airport didn't get too crowded. Tip number 10 is to arrive slightly early to avoid queues. As soon as the desk number came up on the screen when I was there, everybody flocked to the queue and I still had to queue up for half an hour because I was at the back. Tip number 11 is to expect delays at check-in. So I had to queue for 20 minutes and then I spent almost an hour at the check-in desk because for every passenger that was flying, they had to ring Hong Kong and check that they were actually allowed to transit there. Because I'm not a citizen of Australia, they had to check that my visa was valid and that I was allowed into the country, so somebody had to ring Canberra and it took absolutely ages. Tip number 12 is to check if the plane is running their normal meal service. So BA weren't doing the meal service, they were just doing sandwiches. So I brought all my own food for the journey. Also, not many cafes and restaurants were open in the airport, so you might want to think about bringing food. Just remember that you can't take a metal knife and fork on the plane, so if you are bringing your own food, you might need to bring a spork. Tip number 13 is to bring masks and hand gel. So masks were compulsory to wear in the airport and on the aeroplanes, apart from when you were eating, but they weren't given to you. You're supposed to change them every 4 hours, so make sure you bring enough with you. So I packed a cotton one as well as some disposable ones, and I found the cotton one made me quite sore over my ears because of the weight of it, so I switched to the lighter paper ones. Some airlines gave people face shields because I saw big groups of people walking through the airports wearing them, but we weren't given them on BA or Cathay Pacific. People were wearing all sorts of things though, like floor-length ponchos and strange things over their head. So just wear whatever you feel comfortable in. Tip number 14 is to bring warm clothes and a pillow, because I've heard that some flights aren't giving the blankets and pillows anymore, so you might want to bring your own things. I always bring an eye mask too and earplugs for if I want to sleep. Tip number 15 is to wash your hands regularly. I'm sure you've heard this enough already, but make sure you wash your hands before you eat, particularly if you've touched anything on the aeroplane. They had lots of hand gel dispensers throughout the airports, but you might want to bring your own for the plane. Tip number 16 is to expect health checks at the airport. We had to pass through a temperature camera at Heathrow, both when we got into the airport and when we went on the plane. Also, when we arrived in Sydney, we had to have our temperature checked and we were asked lots of questions by nurses who were waiting at the gate. Tip number 17 is don't expect your own row on the plane. They did space us apart as much as possible, but I did have other people on the same row as me on some parts of the flight. Tip number 18 is to expect delays getting off the plane. We weren't allowed to get off altogether. We had to be called a few rows at a time, so you weren't even allowed to stand up and get your things out of the overhead locker, so it did take quite a long time for everybody to get off the plane. That's it for my tips on flying during COVID-19. If you want to go through this again, you can read the blog post that I've linked below. It was quite a weird experience flying, particularly when all the airports were empty, but it was one of the few flights I've been on where I haven't actually caught a cold, I think because everything is disinfected so thoroughly. You can also watch my video on Australian hotel quarantine if you'll have to do that yourself. Let me know in the comments if you've flown during COVID-19 and you've got any extra tips or you want to share your experience. Please like and subscribe if you want to watch more videos on life in Australia. Thanks for watching.